everybody. My name is Matthew Lynch, and I serve as the Director of Sustainability Initiatives for the UH system. And on behalf of UH, I'd like to welcome you and begin by respectfully offering a land acknowledgement. Wherever you are today, we each of us still exist on land, not only in cyberspace. So please take a moment now, look out of a window, take a breath, and sense your connection to the place that you're in. I recognize Hawaii as an indigenous place, and I ask us all to honor Native Hawaiians, the ancestral descendants of these Aina, who have lived, played, laughed, loved, and taken care of the places of Hawaii for generations upon generations. I'm speaking to you from my home in Kaimiki, which is in the mo'o of Ka'alahu, the Ahupua'a of Kapahulu, in the moku of Kona, on the mokupuni of Oahu, in the Pai'aina of Hawaii. I recognize that generations of Native Hawaiians and their indigenous ancestral knowledge systems have shaped, shaped Hawaii in sustainable ways that allow us to enjoy these gifts today. For this, I'm grateful. And as a settler ally, I seek to support the indigenous peoples of Hawaii to protect their lands and their communities. And I'm committed to dedicating time and resources to working in solidarity. Since January, we have been engaged in a weekly think tank hosted by Consilience Notes to address the question, how must the university transform to remain fit to its context? And COVID-19, of course, has made conversations about sustainability, resilience, and the role of the university in Hawaii's future even more pressing. The hallmarks of sustainability, systems thinking, transdisciplinarity, futures thinking, and so on, are needed now more than ever to address rapidly changing social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental contexts. You are here because we are gathering in 7 sessions over these 4 days to think about how the university might transform to meet these times. And each of you holds unique experiences, perspectives, and expertise that is much needed. Here we are not our positions or our titles on an org chart. Here we gathered as concerned humans who are privileged enough to have our basic needs and our personal safety provided for. And we are fortunate to be able to gather as equals here today, to contemplate together the uncertain futures which lay ahead. This is not a committee meeting, nor is it a brainstorming session. We gather from across our campuses and our communities in an exercise of collective transformation. We're here to get to know each other and to nurture relationships that will help us navigate forward. We are here to think big picture and to bring big thinking into the following 4 specific outcomes. Bouncing forward from the COVID crisis, crowdsourcing recommendations to provide decision support for senior leadership, inviting your participation in working groups for ongoing action, and seeking your feedback on draft sustainability policy updates, the links of which were included in the first welcome email. We'll also be recording today's session for later viewing. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker. Today's lunchtime keynote is with Paul Morgan. Dr. Paul Morgan is a professor in the Department of Educational Foundations and Policy Studies at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. He's the founder and director of Westchester University's certificate programs in education for sustainability, and from 2011 to 2014 served as the university's sustainability coordinator. Dr. Morgan also chairs the board of ACER, which stands for the Amazon Center for Environment, Education, and Research, and he's a frequent presenter at conferences and workshops related to sustainability and education. In fact, Chris and I met Dr. Morgan last year at the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education's annual conference, where he gave a version of this presentation that has had us thinking ever since. So without any further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. Morgan. Just share the screen. Welcome, Paul.
All right.
Your comments today.
Matthew, thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here, wherever here is. I'm coming from southeastern Pennsylvania, the traditional home of the Lenape people. We're getting some interesting weather right now, sort of high winds and rain and trees down. So I'm hoping the lines will stay good, but it seems pretty good for the moment. So I'm going to share my screen here with you. There we go. So I understand that this is the sort of the charge for the series of meetings. It's a very impressive series of sessions, and I'm honored to be a part of it. There's me. I actually look like this now because my hair got so wild over the last couple of months. I finally got a corona cut. And so I'm a little more like a cue ball. But the presentation, and Matthew mentioned that I've done versions of this before, and forgive me for the language, but it is part of the title. It's Inspiring Climate Action by Envisioning Higher Education for Sustainability After the Shit Hits the Fan. And due to the circumstances, I've had to adjust the title a little bit, but I want to emphasize this is about inspiring action. And instead of being really kind of in the future tense when at some point when the shit hits the fan, if you pay attention, the shit has already hit the fan and it looks a little like this if you get up close. And this presents a kind of an interesting set of circumstances, because what I want to really work with you on during your lunchtime is a kind of a thought experiment that is already becoming a reality in a way. And so the elephant in the room, of course, is that we've got a pandemic going on and people are wondering what this means for our climate crisis, for our sustainability challenges. There's lots of articles out there dealing with these topics. You've probably seen them all. And there's been talk that, this is kind of good news in a way, because while there is certainly a lot of suffering going on, people are projecting that, this year we might see a 5% drop in global emissions. So in terms of our climate crisis, that's a good thing, it's seen as. And yet, if you put that in context, it's like a little blip on the chart. You can see there, 2008 to 2010, there was a decrease in emissions because of the recession at that point. This is likely to be a bigger blip, I'm thinking, but the reality is we're probably going to bounce back because that's what happens all the time. And bouncing back means that we're still on a trajectory of basically being kind of out of control. We would need still a steep decline. And so while there may be some good news, some silver lining to this, our situation is still critical. And so there is this sense of urgency. These days, if you're paying attention, how do we pick up the pace and accelerate impact? That's what we're talking about. And perhaps that's why you folks are having this conference, because we need to take action. This is a critical decade. I've kind of thought about this as a kind of a dance of urgency going on. If you're a man of a particular age, that means something else. But this dance of urgency is seen in many forms. We're not talking about climate change anymore, for instance. We're talking about the global climate crisis or the climate emergency. Bill McKibben's featured on the front of Time magazine with other people. Extinction Rebellion is out saying this is critical. Of course, no presentation is complete these days without a picture of Greta Thunberg, who's obviously raised awareness of things as a way of telling us this is urgent and we need to do something. And so there is that sense of urgency. And the last time I did this presentation, I was in Atlanta at the 2020 Higher Education Climate Leadership Summit. And I'm guessing that Hawaii is involved with these climate leadership commitments like other institutions. But the invitation to that summit said, when we meet together in February 2020, the world will have only 10 years left to make the changes necessary to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change. And what they were referring to, of course, was conclusions from this report, this IPCC report that came out in late 2018. And it had this kind of interesting and startling pronouncement that governments around the world must make, quote, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society to avoid disastrous levels of global warming. And if you let that sink in, I mean, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented, that's challenging. There's no doubt. And I've been working in the world of higher ed sustainability for more than 20 years and have done a lot of great work. So I include myself and my work in this when I say, despite significant progress, award-winning accomplishments, and a greater sense of urgency, higher education still has not yet made the bold transformations needed to address the depth and scale of our climate and sustainability challenges, And you could say that efforts have not been rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented. So the problem is it all amounts to sort of business as usual with a little less carbon, right? Business as usual with a little less carbon. And while I'm focusing on climate change here, there's plenty of other related issues that we can sort of lump into this, because it really has been kind of this momentum of business as usual, right? And so there are some critical questions we need to ask. And during our time together, we'll have opportunity, I think, for two sort of breakout groups. So the first set of questions has to do with why we're not making these kind of unprecedented changes. This is a challenge for everybody who works in a big institution. We want to move faster, and there's sort of institutional momentum and just kind of ways of doing things that often present that. And so I'll ask you to take notes here, because in the breakout group, I don't think you'll be able to see the screen. But the first question, which you can discuss, is, what are the real and perceived barriers to making rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in our institutions? So what are the barriers? And then secondly, what would have to happen to loosen or dissolve these barriers? What could loosen us, move us out of business as usual? Now the second one becomes an interesting question right now, because already in the case of the pandemic that we're experiencing, there are things that are happening that people would not have imagined. Because of that pandemic, there are possibilities that weren't possible, not too long ago. And so we're not wishing more on people in terms of devastating crises, but what would have to happen to loosen our institutions so that we could make those changes necessary, all right? So it's really about, sense of urgency versus business as usual. So I'm going to
back over to Paul Morgan to continue where we left
Great.
off.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we can, since I know we were just getting sort of going in my group as well. I heard some great stuff with Chris, Joshua, and Sharon, but maybe we can get some volunteers, maybe the person with the longest hair in the group, to share a little something of what you discussed, and then we'll move on into the next one, and then we'll have another opportunity to go back into the breakout group. So can we have just volunteers to chime in?
I'm nominating Sonia and maybe Joshua Cooper, based on your criteria. Anyone who'd like to share from your group, really.
Yeah, I guess I may have the longest hair.
Sonia, very good.
So our real and perceived barriers came around academic freedom and academic expectations, tapping into one another's resources. Structure and financing, the forces that our departments have to fend for themselves. Nalani also spoke about tourism, military occupation, and circular economies, and ways in which we can shift paradigms not only around the way we structure the university, but the way we think about education. So I'm hoping that's a synopsis of the four of us.
Great.
All right, so in our group, we really talked about the people who are benefiting the most with business as usual are in the power at the ledge and thinking they're doing more than enough to actually be where we need to be. And we all know it's not as far or rapid and far reaching as we need. And the other side, of course, was we as the university also need to model that. If it is so rapid and far reaching, what are we doing and how are we going about doing that to be able to impact and have that impact in Hawaii and in our islands. And there was a lot more, but such a short time period, I want to make sure everybody's allowed to share.
Anybody else like to share from your group?
I guess I can share from our group. We basically talked about two things. One was sort of internal, in the sense that we have a desire to change, but because we're so busy, often the reality of our life inhibits the change from actually happening. And the other thing is the inherent bureaucracy of the university. So the example I used was getting people to allow them to work from home. The layers of bureaucracy on approvals and work plans and forms was a bit of a bureaucratic nightmare. Sort of the assumption is we can't trust people to go home and do the work. We have to, and there's all the documents, so that bureaucracy often inhibits people from even wanting to try.
Yeah.
I can share for us too. I had the Vistas, right, in my group, and these are the people that, had to face this literally as part of their job description. And so, I had thought that it had to do with operations and rules and regulations and job descriptions. Just thinking about an incident that happened on our campus where our sustainable garden didn't get watered over the summer because it wasn't part of the facilities maintenance descriptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was actually a kind of a nasty battle over that. But the other folks, they pointed out that, yeah, sometimes it's just people's belief systems that they had to work with. If you don't believe in climate change in the first place, and then that's the person you get to work with, that's a problem. And then, you know, issues with the fact, which kind of relates to the thing I was talking about, where a lot of these people are in units that have suffered from staff cuts. And so facilitating these changes on top of what they already have doing is a problem.
Our group had two foci. One was the general, people don't want to move towards sustainability because they need to find something that they like better than the convenience of doing what they are now. And then there was also another one on sustainability treatment at the university. And there were some comments about faculty who were getting stress from those higher up or more senior to them in teaching various aspects of sustainability in their courses because it wasn't typical. And we've always done it that way.
Okay. Well, I think that was a great sampling. I appreciate everyone's spirited participation. And what I'd like to do is kind of shift next to another thought experiment that gets us into kind of the nitty gritty, as it were. And it looks like this. I'm going to get it. You know, at some point in the near future, and this is the experiment, it's quite possible, so this is not pie in the sky, it's quite possible that the shit will hit the fan in some way. And what I'm talking about is not some apocalypse. You know, there was an asteroid that nearly hit the planet recently, yesterday actually. We're not talking about that, and we're not where people are taking selfies with the Statue of Liberty going down. We're talking about something like this. This is not an actual photo, but this is, you know, Miami. And it's not preposterous because this was Miami a couple of years ago. We talk about the shit hitting the fan. If you read The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, there's, you know, a whole accounting of the ways in which this could happen. This happened in California, more recently in Australia, where you had a prime minister who was coal-loving, suddenly backed into a corner because it was very hard to deny the reality of climate change when your country is on fire. So for all intents and purposes, the shit hit the fan, and things that were not possible suddenly became possible, right? And this is really about a pivotal moment in time. It can be a tipping point when we get to that point where, well, what wasn't possible yesterday is suddenly possible today. It's sort of that idea of Sisyphus pushing the rock up. Some of you mentioned that it was often the barriers were bureaucratic, as we see, but suddenly, you know, barriers evaporate. Like I said, I've been working in sustainability in higher ed for more than 20 years, and it has been like pushing a rock up a hill. We've made progress, but there's been backsliding, and it's very, very, very difficult. But using this thought experiment, okay, what happens if the shit hits the fan, Miami goes under, and becomes absolutely clear to everybody that our challenges are real, existential, and urgent, all right? At that point, obstacles to action will melt away. Higher ed sustainability advocates, people like us, and leaders will be called on to present plans for rapidly transforming the purposes and practices of higher education to respond to the crisis, all right? And this is a thought experiment and also a very real possibility. And so at that point, when suddenly things become very, very easy, the question is, you know, what are we going to promote? What are we going to propose? What are the things that we'd say, this is what we have to do? These are the priorities. When permission is granted and all those bureaucratic belief system barriers and everything else you folks mentioned just sort of disappear. When we get over the top, we're no longer pushing the rock up the hill. Another way to think about this is what exactly would colleges and universities have to become or be to keep themselves relevant after the shit hits the fan, all right? This is, you know, obviously an interesting question right now because we're in the midst of a pandemic and we're not even sure what's going to happen in the fall, certainly at my institution. Things are changing. But in the context of climate emergency, of our sustainability challenges, in that headspace where we'd say, well, shit hits the fan, this is what I would say are the priorities. What would you put on that list? How would we go back to top administration, leaders of various kinds, and say, this is what we need to do? Okay, so what I'd like you to do is go back into some breakout rooms, think about that through that thought experiment. You know, shit hits the fan, some terrible thing happens, and suddenly we have permission to propose and carry out all the things that we believe would be the most important things that we could do to actually address the challenge over the next 10 years. And as you do that, think about kind of evaluating it as you go. I had some depressing answers when I did this with some younger students, one of whom said, well, we'd make recycling more convenient. I said, well, that's like way to the, you know, the side. That should not be the central concern, right? So think about whether the proposals you're making are really just sort of business as usual, but they kind of have a whiff of transformation. And you can think about how much what you're doing now compares to what we would be doing if the shit hits the fan, all right? And then, and of course, how can we generate momentum needed to make sure that our visions come into from margin to center before this happens? But I'd love to hear you generate some proposals and things, because then we have a clear sense of what we ought to be doing in a way. And then we can have a conversation around that. All right. So afterwards, I'll give you the right answers because everyone wants to know. So Krista, I'm going to turn it over to you again. If you can put us in rooms and have everybody basically come up with some ideas about what would be those priorities when the shit hits the fan.
Great. Here we go. Have fun. Maybe we'll go a tiny bit longer, 7 minutes.
You're in
It's a
charge.
great question. Thank you so much.
Oh, could you go forward one slide? I've got to put those in the chat.
I took a screenshot.
Okay, I got the first two questions. What changes would you propose when barriers to implementation melt away? And then I got the, do the proposals match the depth and urgency? But I missed the last two. I'm gonna go to my breakout room.
Okay, I'll send it.
Thanks. my group for the awesome discussions that we had.
One thing it would be useful, I think, for the university is to really encourage public intellectuals. And, and I know, like, I've, in conversations with faculty at UH Manoa, certainly, and I suspect generally, to most people, the university is not that relevant. I mean, it's a place where you get a degree and so on, but if you tried to sort of list the number of active intellectuals that are engaging in policy conversations and so on, there are very few, like a dozen at best, maybe. And, and I think part of that is institutionally, the university doesn't really encourage that kind of interaction, right? That if you give a public talk, or if you're on the news or whatever, that doesn't matter. And I think if we want to become part of Hawaii, then encouraging that kind of interaction becomes important. So that's what I was going to rant about. But yeah,
not a rant at all. And Brian, my apologies. I was trying to recall your voice, and I was actually looking at my friend Bruce Amy Watson.
I get called all sorts of things. Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah.
Well, Bruce is a really handsome bug. I'm digging your haircut too, Bruce. And one of your group has volunteered you to share some of your thoughts. So would you mind sharing?
Yeah, I guess I was in the middle of a rant, but because at first I go, the whole idea of, because my specialty, aloha, I'm Bruce, everybody, is history of education and then indigenous philosophy. And so if more people knew that universities were created to manufacture shoes, and then when we create shoes, they're like, oh my God, they created shoes. How did this happen? How do we stop making shoes? Stop being a shoe factory. And so you have to like retool and get rid of the cobblers and change the machinery in order for it to work. But one of those things is having a base philosophy, an indigenous philosophy that's specific to this place, is based off of thousands of years of existing in this space in a sustainable manner, and acquiring and valuing data from various sources, including like natural phenomena, and then the land itself and what it produces, as well as people, and making a decision that finds a point between all three, and not making a Kanaka-centric, a people-centric decision, which is what the current system feeds, and what it measures and what it counts is what it can produce. Like if you're working in a shoe factory, it's about how many shoes you produced, not how you felt about making them. And so we're gonna make you miserable as long as you can make 20 more Nikes than you did last week. So yeah, something like that. Sorry, squirrels ran.
Not at all, no, Bruce, not a rant at all. I could listen to you articulate your thoughts for hours. Paul, do you think we have time for one more share?
Yeah, well, let's do one more, and then we'll kind of move into the home stretch. But this is really great, and I'm glad people are capturing this in the chat. So
yeah,
Nalani.
Sure, Nalani, go ahead.
I'd like to share something. Our group was kind of on the same page in terms of looking at we need to have common knowledge. And if we look at right now, one of the mottos of the university is above all else humanity. But if that were shifted to above all else human intelligence in alignments with nature intelligence, I think it would do more for our understanding of our capacity as human beings who come from different cultures, different understandings, but have to now be super cooperators and understand, not only what the natural laws and the cultural laws are, but how we can save our part of the world, Hawaii. And I've just been helping to teach a course with 3 really great kumu who are using the knowledge of our culture and indigenous culture to help the students come from kind of a common knowledge place. And on our group, people were saying that in different ways. Like we could have wisdom. We need emphasis on wisdom as common knowledge. We need emphasis on all of the sciences, on sustainability, on regenerative farming, on resiliency, on water management. And in our culture, it comes from the knowledge of the 8 realms and the real purpose of human beings to live with nature in a way that is more as a protector, a manager, and a healer. And so these are kind of common base things that if we all came more developed in our capacity to share common knowledge, we would create the critical mass that then could create the quantum leaps in all directions, whether it was food security or, you know, making sure that everyone has a place to live, or moving the airport from the reef to the middle of the island, you know, whatever problem needs to happen, then all students, all faculty, all of our university system, which is already organized on 10 campuses within our islands, could be the centers of distributing seeds, you know, or huli, or organizing the teaching and training of everybody for whatever problems and solutions are needed in their area, and then having a dashboard that monitors all of that so we all can keep track of the gas emissions. We all can see, just like how nature is recovering herself right now by getting a rest, are our actions taking things in the right direction? We can actually see it together.
Thank you. There's so much. I'm saddened that we only have an hour together, and I'm noting all of the amazing conversations that are going on in the chat. So just a quick note that we will be sending a synthesis of this out. So never fear if you're worried about not being able to read through all of those, there will be a synthesis of that sent out. But I want to turn it back over to Paul to take us through the home stretch. Paul, go ahead.
Okay. I'm looking for my, I need to get to my, there we go. It disappeared. Okay. So now, of course, I want to give you the right answers, but just kidding. The things that you came up with, really, really interesting. And I think you folks have it all figured out. I'm here to offer some encouragement along things that I've been thinking about along these questions. One way to imagine this, and I come from, you know, I'm an educator and by training, philosopher of education. So I'm always thinking about, what are we here for? What are we doing this for? And one of my colleagues put it this way, says, how do we ensure that graduates are not our most harmful emissions? And it really brings it down to the students, because we could be, you know, a carbon neutral campus. You in Hawaii could do fantastic. But if what we're spitting out the other end, and I really like Bruce's way of thinking about this, you know, it's just shoes, then, you know, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And so let's think about our core mission. And if we think about the core mission, then we think about working with students to respond to the climate challenges, really becoming much more student-centric and making sure we're sensitive to the kinds of things that make learning really meaningful, that get us excited to be working in an educational institution, right? The last conference, you know, this is Varshini Prakash, who's the leader of the Sunrise Movement. And, you know, we think about, you know, how can we make sure we have more young people who rise up like this, and so passionate and informed and not cynical and, you know, not jaded, really making it happen. So I think there's a lot to be said about focusing on the young people and the students. But there's also something to be said about, just going back to Bruce's point, if we're no longer making shoes, what are we going to make? Sterling College has set an example, because what they've said essentially is, and this was their pronouncement, higher education is complicit in the climate emergency. We are going to change our mission and our vision, right? We're no longer going to do this. We're no longer going to educate for industrial breakdown. We're going to educate for a regenerative future. That's our mission now. It's different than it was before. And so from the very top, needing to think about, what are we doing here? What is our mission? What is our vision? What are we really up to? For so long, that conversation hasn't happened because we all assumed it was for progress or, you know, whatever. So these vague, empty ideas that don't get us anywhere. This is an opportunity to think, yeah, very clearly about what we're trying to accomplish. And there are institutions that have done this, and they can be models. You know, this is now the classrooms at my institution, but think there about what's going on in terms of curriculum, right? We talked about this, and I was inspired to hear some of you mention really the big questions. When we talk about wisdom, I learned from this book by Roy Scranton, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, because when we think about our climate and sustainability challenges, it often gets framed in sort of these very technical or scientific terms, but it really comes down to fundamental questions of what it means to be a human being in a particular place on the planet at this time, right? So, you know, these are questions of, yeah, what does it mean to be human? This is a time to rethink that. What does it mean to live well? What is good? What is the truth? These are fundamental questions at the core of higher education and a good liberal arts education. And they've been kind of pushed to the side because we focus so much on STEM and progress and beating the pants off others in global economic competition. But this is the heart of a good education. And I think we've lost our way along these issues because nobody seems to take these seriously. All right. And so there's room for the humanities and the arts to address these in really important ways. Pedagogy, of course. If this is our sustainability class, then there's something wrong, you know. Simply changing the curriculum or what's on the syllabus isn't going to matter. And this is where I think, you know, I heard this echoed from some of you saying it needs to be much more experiential, place-based, community-based. Otherwise, young people are not going to be interested. And they're going to say, why bother going to college? There's a climate emergency. It's not training me. It's not educating me to deal with things as they are. We need to get outside. So I certainly envision, I'm going to skip over that, people doing much more place-based service learning, doing things that really amount to viewing our institutions as simultaneously retreat centers, where we're asking the big questions of what it means to be a human, but also simultaneously hubs of community engagement, places where we're going to kind of generate the kind of energy and interest and enthusiasm that young people can offer if given an opportunity. And too often, I think their energy and intelligence is kind of wasted because they're sitting in classes, you know, looking at PowerPoint presentations and doing stuff that sort of goes around in a circle but doesn't really get them anywhere. Other inspirations that I've found, books like this by Carrie Facer, Learning Futures. We've all been sold a vision of the future, what it's supposed to look like. And it looks like, I'll get ahead, like this, some techno-utopia where people are in, you know, flying cars. The problem with this, of course, is it's all white people flying around in a world with no trees, eating food out of machines. That's the vision of the future we've been sold. We need to imagine a different one and then grow into that and make it, because we will not, you know, create what we cannot imagine. And so I think there's opportunity here to really be imagining something else. So this is already happening. And you know, I was at a presentation recently with Paul Hawken, and his new book is about, you know, regeneration. And certainly the future that we want to imagine, I think, is going to be a lot about regeneration. Some other things that I think are going to be important. This gets a little more technical, but I appreciated what I think it was Brian mentioned about how, you know, becoming a public intellectual, that could be important. This is work by Nicholas Maxwell, and his book, you know, How Universities Can Help Create a Wiser World, seems to be very important now. When we think about the academic research that's done, you know, I think about this stuff I did as a junior faculty member, you know, got published, 12 people read it, and then I got tenure, and now I feel like I can do, you know, the stuff that's more important. But there's arguably, and I think we need to be honest with ourselves, there's an awful lot of research going on in institutions that's not really pushing back the borders of knowledge and not really helping the community. I think the expectation is going to be the work that we do is going to have to be much more applied toward the real and existential challenges. And so there's ways of rethinking what it means to be an academic and what it means to do research. And this is a great guidepost, I think. So as we kind of come to the end here, you know, I would encourage us to think how we can individually and collectively, you know, generate the momentum needed to move these kinds of visions that you've all generated from the center, from the margins, excuse me, to the center before the shit hits the fan, so that we can make progress. And I hope this helps us think and clarify a little bit about, you know, the stuff that we're working on that may be a little bit you know, tangential, and that, you know, we might need to focus on things that are really going to make a difference. That's what I've been trying to do. And I don't come here with all the right answers, but I come here looking for, and this is one of my favorite words these days, for courage. You know, there is that word to encourage people. But of course, the real stem of that is courage. We all need the courage to be able to do what we know is right, to do that we know is helpful. And so when I make presentations like this, I come in looking to be encouraged, to be given a little more fiber so I can do in my life what I need to do. And I'm hoping we can all offer that to each other, that courage that we need to do to make a difference. So we have until 2030, 10 years goes fast. You know, I never thought I'd be this old, but here I am because time flies. And so I'm hoping we can all kind of think about 2030 as being now. We can't wait till 2029 and do an all-nighter to solve all of these problems, right? Because it's coming up on us fast. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I wasn't there in person to enjoy lunch with you, but it's been a great group, and I thank the organizers for making this happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. This has been really great. I really want to also acknowledge you for creating a space for this interaction. That was really refreshing, and much needed, judging from the vitality and vibrancy of the chat that's going on here.
Really
I'm
impressive.
going to turn it over to Krista just to formally close us out as we near the top of the hour. Hang on, I got you. I thought I unmuted you. We were doing so smooth.
Okay, I'm good.
Oh, she's there.
I got it. I lost myself there for a minute. I just want to close the session with gratitude. Thank you, all of you, for making time for this talk. And thank you so much to Paul. This session, and in fact, this whole retreat, is about relationships, and the people and the relationships are what make the university. And I really appreciate that I've gotten to get to know Paul and other scholars at other universities that help us to see how we are unique, and how also we are part of a bigger transformation also in higher education as a sector. So Paul, thank you. It was so generous of you to share your time with us, and I'm such a huge fan. I hope that you will all come back and join us tonight for Zoom cocktails in your home. We're having an informal Zoom networking. We'll be doing some breakout rooms as we did today, get to know some new people, and we will be continuing this conversation tonight in an informal setting. So that will be starting at 7 p.m. You should have received all of the Zoom links in your welcome email. I think that's all, Matt.
Yeah, that's it. We're going to formally close it out. So if you want, go ahead and unmute, and you can say a hui ho to everybody. Stay tuned to your emails. We'll be in touch with more information and resources and communications. And
Hui ho.
Mahalo again.
Hui ho. Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you, Matt and Kristen.
Holiday.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Paul.